For 31 years, I worked as a family court mediator in Halifax. I sat across from people on the worst days of their lives, and I helped them find a way through. I was trained to stay calm when everyone else in the room was falling apart. I knew how to read a situation, how to listen past what someone was saying to hear what they actually meant. I thought that skill set made me better prepared than most parents. I was wrong. Nothing prepares you to watch it happen to your own child. My daughter's name is Ren. She is the kind of person who lights up a room without trying, not because she's loud or showy, but because she's genuinely curious about people. She became a physiotherapist. She had a way of making her patients feel like they were the most interesting person she'd ever met. She got that from her father, God rest him. He passed when Ren was 22. And I think that grief is part of why she fell so hard when she finally met someone who seemed to see her the way he did. She met her husband at a fundraiser for the IYK Health Centre in downtown Halifax. He was tall, well-dressed, working in commercial real estate. He found her across the room during the silent auction and spent the entire evening asking her questions about her work, her patients, what drew her to physiotherapy in the first place. She called me the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee. "Mom," she said, "I think I met someone." I remember smiling into the phone. I remember thinking she deserved this. His name was Conrad. He was 38, divorced once, no children. He had a mother named Sylvie, who lived out in Dartmouth in a house Conrad had helped her buy after her second husband left. He talked about his mother often. He talked about how much she had sacrificed for him growing up, how she had worked double shifts at the hospital as a dietary aide so he could play hockey, so he could go to university. He spoke about her with a reverence that I found, at the time, touching. I should have paid more attention to that. I should have listened past the words. They dated for 14 months before he proposed. The proposal was at the Citadel, just before sunset. He had arranged for a string quartet. He had called me 2 weeks before to ask my blessing, which I gave. Ren said yes with tears running down her face, and I cried watching the video she sent me that night. I thought I genuinely believed that she had found something solid, something real. The first year of their marriage, they lived in a condo in the South End. Ren kept her job at the clinic. Conrad worked long hours, but he always texted when he was running late. They came for dinner every other Sunday. He brought wine, always a good bottle, always something he'd picked out himself. He asked about my garden. He helped clear the table without being asked. It was in the second year that I started to notice the pauses. Not anything dramatic, not anything I could point to directly, just pauses. A small hesitation before Ren answered a simple question, a quick glance at Conrad before she spoke, the way she reached for her water glass when I asked how her week had been, buying herself a second to think. I told myself she was tired. She'd taken on more clients at the clinic. They were saving for a house. Marriage was an adjustment. I told myself all the reasonable things that a reasonable person tells themselves when they don't want to see what's right in front of them. The first concrete thing was the Christmas dinner at his mother's place. Sylvie had a house in Dartmouth, neat and small, with a collection of ceramic angels on every available surface. She had cooked for hours. I arrived with a bottle of Riesling and a loaf of cranberry bread I'd made that morning. Sylvie opened the door and looked at the bread and said, without any particular cruelty, just matter-of-factly, "Conrad doesn't eat store-bought things in the house. Did Ren not tell you?" I said I'd made it myself. She looked at it again and said, "Well, we'll see." She put it on the counter, and it stayed there untouched through the entire meal. At dinner, Conrad asked Ren to pass the gravy, and when she reached across the table, she knocked over his water glass. Just barely. The glass didn't break. The water spread maybe 6 inches. Conrad put his fork down very slowly and looked at her. He didn't say anything, he just looked. And Ren apologized. Over and over, with a kind of urgency that had nothing to do with the spilled glass of water, Sylvie patted Conrad's arm and said, "It's fine, sweetheart, she'll learn." I drove home that night with my hands tight on the wheel, and I didn't know exactly what I'd witnessed, but I felt it. Somewhere in my chest, behind my sternum, the way you feel a shift in the weather before the clouds arrive. By the third year, Wren had stopped talking about her patients. Not all at once. Gradually. The stories she used to tell me, the retired veteran who got back on a bicycle for the first time in 40 years. The teenager with the spinal surgery who cried the day she walked unassisted. Those stories stopped coming. I asked once and she said she was tired of bringing work home. I asked a second time a few months later and she said Conrad found medical talk at the dinner table a bit much. She had also stopped having lunch with her colleague who had been her closest friend since university. She had also stopped coming to the community choir she'd sung in for 6 years. She had also started wearing her hair differently, pulled back, flat, the kind of style that takes up less space. I am a family court mediator. I have a graduate degree in conflict resolution. I have read every clinical framework for identifying coercive control that exists in this country, and I sat across a Sunday dinner table from my daughter, and I told myself she was just going through a phase, that every couple finds their rhythm, that I needed to respect her choices. The mind protects itself. Even trained minds. Even minds that should know better. The dinner that changed everything was not at Christmas. It was a Saturday in late March, the kind of grey Halifax day where the harbour disappears into the sky, and you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Wren had invited me over for dinner. She had made a beef bourguignon, which she had been working on all day. She'd texted me a photo of the Dutch oven on the stove at 2 in the afternoon, proud of it. Conrad's mother arrived an hour before I did. I didn't know she was coming until I walked through the door and saw her coat on the hook. The table was set nicely. Wren had put out the good napkins, the ones with the embroidered edge that had been her grandmother's. The bourguignon smelled extraordinary. She had also made bread, real bread, the kind that takes 3 hours, and a salad with roasted beets and goat cheese from a farm in the Annapolis Valley. We sat down. Sylvie inspected her bowl before picking up her spoon. She stirred it once. She looked across at Conrad and said, "The sauce is thin." Conrad tasted his. He set his spoon down. He said to Wren, "It's thin." Wren said she had followed the recipe exactly. She said it had simmered for 3 hours. Conrad said, "The recipe isn't the problem." Sylvie made a small sound, not quite a laugh, something between amusement and satisfaction. Wren put her fork down. She looked at her plate, and then she said very quietly, "I'm sorry, I'll do better next time." Something in me cracked open. I had heard those words before. Not in that kitchen, in my courtroom, from women sitting across mediation tables who had spent years apologizing for things that were never their fault. I had heard that particular quality of resignation, not just sadness, not just embarrassment, but the sound of someone who had been apologizing for so long, they no longer questioned whether the apology was warranted. I put my napkin on the table. I looked at my daughter and I said, "Wren, this food is exceptional." She looked up at me and I saw something flicker in her eyes, something that looked like being remembered. Conrad said, "My mother was just making an observation." I looked at him. I said, "Conrad, your mother was criticizing your wife's cooking in her own home, in front of a guest. That's not an observation. That's something else." The temperature in the room changed. Sylvie said, "I've been making this dish for 30 years. I know what it's supposed to taste like." I said, "I'm sure you do. And Wren has made a beautiful dinner. I'd like to enjoy it." Conrad said, quietly, "The way people say things when they want you to know they are controlling themselves. You're a guest here, too." And I said, "Yes, I am Wren's mother, which makes me something more than a guest." We finished the meal in near silence. Sylvie ate every bite. I noticed that. I stayed to help Wren with the dishes after Conrad drove his mother home. We stood at the sink together, and I washed and she dried, the way we had done since she was 8 years old, and I waited. I didn't push. I've learned in 30 years of mediation that the most important thing you can do is leave space. People fill space when they feel safe. After about 10 minutes, Ren said, "He's not always like that." I said, "Tell me what he's like when he's not like that." She was quiet for a moment. She folded the dish towel very carefully before she spoke. "He's kind," she said. "When it's just us, he's kind. He has high standards." His mother raised him with high standards, and I think I'm still learning what those are. I said, "Ren, how long have you been trying to meet those standards?" She didn't answer. I said, "How long has it been since you went to choir?" She put the dish towel down and she looked out the window over the sink at the dark backyard, and I watched her face do something complicated. I watched her add things up. "He said it took up too much of my energy," she said finally. "He said I came home from rehearsals distracted." I said, "And your friend from the clinic?" A long pause. "She didn't understand our lifestyle," Ren said. The phrase sounded borrowed. It didn't sound like my daughter. I didn't sound like my daughter. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just kept washing. Then I said, very carefully, "Do you remember what your father used to say when you were a teenager and you'd come home upset about something someone had done to you?" She almost smiled. He said, "Tell me the whole story. Start from the beginning. Don't leave out the part that makes you look bad." He said that, I agreed, because he trusted you to know the difference. He trusted your version of events. She turned to look at me then. I said, "I trust your version too, whatever it is." She didn't tell me everything that night, but she started, and starting is the thing. Starting is almost always the hardest part. Over the next 3 weeks, she called me every few days. Always when Conrad was at work, I noticed. She told me about the first time he had criticized her in front of a colleague at a work event, a comment about how she had described her job, about how she had made it sound less significant than his. She told me about the way he monitored their joint account and asked her to explain purchases she made for herself. She told me about the time she had come home late from a session that had run long. Not her fault. A patient had been in distress, and he had not spoken to her for 2 full days. She told me about a Saturday morning 3 months earlier when she had been laughing at something on the radio, and he had come into the kitchen and looked at her laughing and said, "You should hear yourself." She had not laughed easily since then. Everything she described had a name. I knew the names. I had read the research. I had sat with the frameworks. I had helped draft the documentation for cases far more severe. Coercive control, systematic erosion, emotional abuse. I knew all the clinical language. What I had not fully understood until that moment was what it sounds like when it is your daughter telling you, what it costs her to say each sentence, how long it takes to get there. I did not panic. That was the most important thing. If I had cried, if I had raged, if I had said what I genuinely wanted to say about Conrad and his mother and what I thought of the both of them, Ren would have stepped back. She would have defended him. I had watched it happen 100 times. The moment the support person becomes too loud, the person in the center of the storm goes quiet. I said, "You don't have to decide anything tonight, but I want you to know that whatever you decide, I have the capacity to help you. I know people. I know the process. You would not be starting from scratch." She said, "I don't know if I'm ready." I said, "That's okay. I'll be here when you are." What I did not tell her, what I did quietly, on my own time, over the following week, was that I called a colleague I'd worked with for 20 years, who was now a senior partner at a family law firm on Spring Garden Road. I explained the situation in broad strokes. I asked her what a woman in Ren's circumstances would need to know about her options in Nova Scotia. We talked for an hour. I made notes. I also called a friend who ran a counseling practice that specialized in trauma recovery. I described what Ren had told me without using names. She told me what to listen for. She told me what to expect, emotionally, from Ren over the coming weeks and months. She told me that the process of leaving, when Ren was ready to call it that, would not be linear. And then I waited. I did not push. I called when I said I would call. I came for tea when she asked. I listened far more than I spoke. 6 weeks after that dinner, Ren called me on a Wednesday afternoon. It was the middle of the day, unusual for her. She said she had spent the morning at the clinic, and a patient had come in. A woman about 20 years older than Ren, a woman who walked with a cane and had a careful, deliberate way of moving. Someone who had been through something significant and rebuilt herself afterward. They had talked during the session, the way patients sometimes talk when they feel held, and the woman had said something that Ren could not unhear. She had said, "I lost 10 years. I would give almost anything to have those 10 years back, but I can't. So now I just make sure I don't lose the next 10. Ren said, "I'm ready." I said, "Okay, come to my house, I'll put the kettle on." She moved out on a Friday evening in May. Conrad was at a property showing in Bedford. Ren had packed what she needed over 3 days in small amounts. Books, documents, her grandmother's napkins, the framed photograph of her and her father from her university graduation, her grandmother's ring. We had arranged for a friend of mine, a retired RCMP officer, to be available by phone if needed. She was not needed. Ren was at my door by 6 o'clock. She sat in my kitchen with both hands around a mug of tea, and she didn't say anything for a long time. She looked out the window at my garden, where the first tulips were coming up, the ones I'd planted with her when she was 12 years old. A spring tradition we'd kept going until life got complicated. "The tulips are early this year," she said. I said, "They've been waiting for you." She laughed, a real one, unguarded, the laugh I hadn't heard in almost 2 years. My colleague on Spring Garden Road took Ren's case. The process in Nova Scotia was not fast, but it was clear. Conrad contested certain things. His mother called my number twice. I didn't answer. The second time she left a message that I listened to once and then deleted. There was nothing in it worth keeping. Ren began seeing the trauma counselor 6 weeks after she moved out. She went back to her clinic. She started running again, something she'd given up 3 years ago because Conrad had said her schedule was too full. She ran along the waterfront in the mornings, through Point Pleasant Park when the weather was good. She called me after some of those runs, just to talk about nothing. The osprey she'd seen over the northwest arm, the smell of the salt air after rain. She went back to choir 8 months after she moved out. I went to their first public concert of the season. I sat in the 3rd row of St. Matthew's United Church on Barrington Street, in a wooden pew that creaked every time I shifted, and I watched my daughter stand in the 2nd row of the soprano section and open her mouth and sing. I have sat in courtrooms. I have mediated agreements between people who could not stand the sight of each other. I have helped facilitate outcomes that required extraordinary restraint from everyone in the room. I have held my composure in situations that most people would find unbearable. I did not hold my composure in that pew. I cried for the first hymn and half the second, and I didn't care at all who saw me. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with watching someone you love disappear slowly. It is not like sudden loss. Sudden loss is a fracture. It's sharp and it's clean, and the pain is enormous, but you know exactly what happened. This other kind is different. This other kind is erosion. It happens the way the coastline changes, not all at once, just a little at a time, season after season, until one day you look up, and the shape of things is different from what you remember, and you can't point to exactly when it changed. I am not a perfect mother. I did not catch it fast enough. I asked myself that question many times in the months after. What if I had spoken sooner? What if I had named what I saw at that Christmas dinner, instead of telling myself I was overreacting? What if I had pushed a little harder, a little earlier? But I have also sat across from enough people in enough difficult rooms to know that the timing of these things is rarely simple. Ren had to be ready. I could prepare. I could position. I could learn what she would need and have it ready when she asked for it. But I could not ask it for her. That part had to be hers. What I could do, what I did do, was stay close, stay available, make sure she never forgot that there was a version of herself that existed before Conrad, a version that laughed without permission, that sang in choirs, that told stories about her patients and meant every word. That version of my daughter is back now. She is not exactly the same as she was before. No one is after something like that. She is more careful and also more deliberate. She knows her own voice better than she ever did. She set a boundary last month with a friend who had been taking advantage of her good nature for years, and she did it calmly and clearly and without apologizing. She told me about it over the phone, and I could hear the steadiness in her. She is still running. She ran at 10K last September for the YWCA Canada fundraiser, and she called me from the finish line, out of breath, laughing. I could hear the other runners in the background, the music from the speakers, the whole noise of people gathered for something good. If you are watching this and something in this story sounds familiar, not the details but the feeling, please tell someone. It doesn't have to be a parent. It doesn't have to be a parenter. It can be one person, one conversation, one moment of letting yourself be seen by someone who is paying attention. That is where it starts. That one moment. What city are you watching from today, and what part of this story stayed with you? I think about that March dinner sometimes. The smell of the bourguignon still in the air, my daughter's hands folded in her lap, and the way she said, "I'm sorry," to a bowl of food she had spent all day making. I think about how long it took me to understand what I was watching, not because I wasn't paying attention, but because we are always the last to see clearly the things that are closest to us. What happened to Ren did not happen all at once. That is the thing I want people to understand. Conrad did not walk into her life as a threat. He walked in as a promise, and then, slowly, methodically, he replaced her sense of herself with his version of her, smaller, quieter, always one apology behind where she needed to be. That kind of erosion does not announce itself. It arrives dressed as love, as standards, as care. And by the time you recognize it for what it is, the person you're looking at has already learned to apologize for things that were never their fault. I have spent my career asking people to tell me the whole story, to be honest, to be precise, to look at what actually happened rather than what they wished had happened. And I failed, for too long, to apply that same rigor to what was happening in my own daughter's kitchen. That is the part I sit with, not with guilt. Guilt is not useful, but with honesty. I should have spoken earlier. I know that now, and knowing it has made me sharper, more willing to say the uncomfortable thing, because silence, even well-meaning silence, has a cost. What saved Ren, and I do not use that word lightly, was not one dramatic moment. It was a series of small, quiet acts of decency, a patient who told the truth about her own lost years, a mother who kept showing up without pushing, a colleague on Spring Garden Road who answered the phone and took an hour she didn't have to spare. Decency is like that. It rarely arrives with fanfare. It arrives as availability, as steadiness, as someone who stays in the room when it would be easier to leave. Ren had to find her own clarity. I could not find it for her. But I could be ready when she did. I could prepare the path so that when she finally took the step, there was somewhere solid to land. That is what I know now about helping someone you love through something like this. Your job is not to rescue. Your job is to remain, to stay informed, to stay calm, to stay present, and to trust that the person you raised still exists somewhere inside the person standing in front of you, even when she's apologizing for a meal that was, by any honest measure, extraordinary. She ran 10 kilometers last September along the Halifax waterfront. She called me from the finish line, out of breath, laughing. I could hear the crowd in the background, the music, all the noise of people gathered for something good. She said, "Mum, I feel like myself again." That sentence was worth every difficult conversation, every careful silence, every moment of holding back when I wanted to say far more than I did. If you are watching this and you recognize something in this story, not the details but the feeling, that slow sense of being made smaller over time, I want you to know that recognition is not nothing. It is the beginning. And beginnings, even hard ones, are worth honoring.